One of the things that Mike said is absolutely true about the being the designated arrestee. I used to be part owner of a reverse distributor in Wisconsin called Capital Returns, and we were one of the fourth, I think, company in that business in 1991. And that's, you got it going? Terrific. Thank you so much. That's where I first learned about RCRA, because I'm a pharmacist, and you know, what did we know? Nothing. We had no training on this, so it was a real revelation to find out that we had a whole big body of law that we knew nothing about. So that's why I got into it, and then I sold that company and started pharmacology in 2000 and tried to bring this up into healthcare, which I think we've done pretty successfully. You know you've got a viable business when you get your first competitor, which we did, and then I had the opportunity to sell it to Waste Management about 3 years ago, so it's been terrific. So educational only, not legal advice, always have to say that. We have a lot to look at today, but I am hopeful that we'll have time for questions afterwards. You have everything in your handout, and if you don't have a clicker, please help yourself in the back. I think there's still some left. So what we want to do is look at the scope of pharmaceutical waste generation, what the evolving awareness has been like, and you know, I'm really preaching to the choir out here in California, but I just give you some background on that in case you need that to help others understand it. And then look a little bit at applying EPA and Cal EPA has waste rules, as Mike had started, the interface with the Medical Waste Management Act, and the relationship to the Drug Enforcement Administration. Now you know why you have the clickers. Because some of you are going, oh my gosh, how am I going to stay awake? We have thumb exercises that you're going to be doing. That's your aerobics. Drugs occur everywhere you can imagine. You know, for good or bad, we're a very drug-oriented society. So you're going to see them in every healthcare facility, all the way from your acute care hospitals through long-term care, clinics, surgery centers, and so forth. You're going to also see them, obviously, in the retail pharmacies, although they have very little waste. I'm a Walgreens alumna, and we didn't have a lot of waste there. But they still have to have some preparation. Mail-order pharmacies, anywhere you look that healthcare is being delivered, veterinary clinics, and then, you know, if we took a poll and I had a question up here, how many of you have ever taken a drug in your life, I would think we'd probably get everybody agreeing to that. So we are part of the problem, but that's an issue we can't deal with today. That's one other folks are looking at. And Mike already mentioned that you know, DEA, EPA, FDA always used to say we're regulated by everybody but AAA. So that's the way it feels sometimes. Lots of things to worry about. What started happening probably late 90s was when the U.S. Geological Survey put out their report, which I'm sure you're familiar with, in terms of drugs being discovered in ground surface and even drinking water. That got a lot of people's attention. And then the media took hold of that in like 2007, 2008. I'll show you a little bit more about that in a moment. That got a lot of attention. Remember, it's 40-some cities. They looked at the drinking water and found drugs in there. And the joke kind of became, you call your doctor, instead of saying, take 2 aspirin and see me in the morning, it's take 2 glasses of water and see me in the morning. You'll get your drug from that. So that really got the Senate and the Congress kind of worked up. It certainly got EPA's attention and, of course, attention of you folks, too, because we suddenly realized that these drugs were not going away. And I got to tell you, when I graduated 40 years ago, we were told to put drugs down the drain because we wanted to get them out of the house, out of the environment, so at least the patient environment, so no one would get poisoned or divert. And that's what we did for many, many years. So we had a long way to go to change belief systems and help people make changes in their behaviors. The Joint Commission, how many of you know what the Joint Commission is? Have you heard that name? Okay, they live in terror at the hospitals of the Joint Commission even more than they live in terror of you folks. Because the Joint Commission is accredited by the Centers for Medicare and Medicaid, and they have to be accredited every 3 years at the hospital level. And if they fail their Joint Commission, which hardly anybody does, but there was a hospital in, I think, LA that did a few years ago, they lose federal funding. And if they lose federal funding, they close their doors. So it's a very, very important organization. There's also another one now called DNV, Det Norske Veritas, and they will come in and check. And what they have to do is make sure that the hospital's following all applicable rules and regulations. So as the Joint Commission learns about this, they're starting to ask questions. So that is another group that is actually helping you folks to encourage people to stay or to get into compliance and stay in compliance. There's a lot of material in the last 10 years about the whole concept of endocrine disruption, which I'm sure you're familiar with. One of them that was most impressive to me was something called the Pharaohs Statement, which was put out in 2007 by a prestigious group of scientists. They were meeting on the Pharaohs Islands in the North Atlantic. And because of the isolation, they had done a 30-year study in terms of exposure and so forth. And they coined this term of fetal programming, in that if a fetus is exposed during certain periods of development to chemicals, genes can be turned on or off inappropriately, and that can affect the organism for the rest of their lives. So if you see some of the long-term effects on here, it sounds like a litany of what we deal with in our culture: the obesity, diabetes, cancer, ADHD, Parkinson's, and so forth. That is why I feel that I have a little problem with the weight thing, you know, the waste, that other waste, because I grew up in the DDT era. So I'm attributing it to that. But it really is serious when you think about it. I remember at Walgreens, for example, we used to dispense diethylstilbestrol, DES. Some of you probably heard of it. It was supposed to prevent miscarriages in pregnant women. We did it for 20 years. Not only didn't it prevent miscarriages, it caused rare vaginal cancers in many of the girl offspring and some plumbing problems in the boys. And that was our first understanding of this whole concept of endocrine disruption in terms of fetal exposure. So I think the field of toxicology is really going to have to change. It's going to have to go from just acute and long-term toxicity to include developmental toxicity, and that's going to be tough. That's going to take a long time. Here's another little guy that some of you may have seen if you've been in the San Diego presentations, but again, another really dramatic example of endocrine disruption. The little tadpole on the left is normal and growing and getting legs and so forth. The guy on the right is the same age and is swimming in 38 parts per billion of Prozac, the common antidepressant. Same age. So you can see there's inhibition of thyroid function here, which is preventing metamorphosis. The good news is he's on Prozac, he really doesn't care. So, you know. And that's how some of us are, right? Having a good day. But it's a very, you know, and this amount can actually be found downstream from some of the wastewater treatment plants. And aquatic species don't have a way out. They're going to be exposed to this day in and day out. Even if a particular drug isn't persistent in the environment, the fact it keeps coming in, and we've heard about estrogen, you know, estrogenic compounds and intersex sex fish and so forth. So it's already affecting our ecosystem. I mentioned earlier, one of the really dramatic shots across the bow, so to speak, was done by the Associated Press. They really hung on this for about a year, did a series of articles. The one that I found very interesting in the September 14th series, they took Minnesota, which is also a state that's very green and very blue, lots of water, and they looked at, they had kind of gotten a handle on the whole RCRA piece, so they looked at waste generation coming out of those facilities, and then they extrapolated to the rest of the country, and they came up with 250 million pounds of waste, pharmaceutical waste coming out of healthcare every year, and about half of that being packaging, but that still leaves 125,000 pounds. That got attention also. So you can see where some of this is coming from. A couple other things that have been going on. This is from 2010, but it's going to have more of an impact in 2013, where the EPA may regulate pharmaceuticals in drinking water. They're looking at a bunch of chemicals, but they're also looking specifically at erythromycin, the antibiotic, and nitroglycerin, the cardiac drug, along with the estrogens. Not quite sure why they picked those, but those are being examined for potential drinking water quality standards, which we've never really had for pharmaceuticals before. And then you've probably also heard that they've been tasked with doing this endocrine disruption study. In fact, I think I just read this week that there was a little bit of, you know, why haven't you done more? And of course the agency says we don't have any money. You can probably relate to those, both of those in this society. But again, drugs like erythromycin, nitroglycerin, lindane, which you have banned in California for human use. It's for licensed scabies. It's illegal to use it here on humans, which is probably a good thing. And then some antibiotic precursors. Now, the other thing that's happening, it's not just RCRA, because that's a pretty confined list, which we'll talk about in a minute. The Office of Water at EPA has gotten very involved in this. They put out a best management draft in 2010. A bunch of us responded. We felt it wasn't clarified enough. I don't know, did anybody read that? Do we have any people that are in the water side? Probably not. Anyway, it was kind of all lumped together, you know, whether you put it in kitty litter or what, and that just doesn't work for healthcare organizations. So they have pulled back on that, and they're redoing it. And I found out that they're waiting, actually, because at the Office of Resource Conservation and Recovery, which is, of course, of more interest to you folks, They have backed away from universal waste. And do you remember when they were thinking about adding hazardous waste pharmaceuticals to the universal waste rule? And they had Florida and Michigan as kind of trial states, where it still is. And they put out their Federal Register announcement. Gee, when was that? I think about 3 or 4 years ago. A bunch of us, again, responded to that and said we're a lot of concerned about losing the manifest, because if you look at who does universal waste, you're talking about bulbs, batteries, pesticides, and so forth. Now we're talking about drugs. And, 2 men in a truck pull up and say, I'm going to take your drugs along with your bulbs and batteries with no control. And that really concerned many of us. So they kind of backed away from that, but they are definitely looking, probably in the spring of 2013 is what we're hearing right now, actually doing some rewriting of the RCRA regs for pharmaceuticals, maybe even adding drugs to the P&U list. So that'll be a big deal if that happens. So it'll be interesting, and I think the Office of Water is going to wait for that. You may have most recently heard about a memo that came out on November 4th. We've got this whole business about P-listed waste, right, and warfarin and nicotine wrappers. Anybody familiar with that? I don't have a clicker on that one. That's causing hospitals no end of grief, as you know. So EPA put out was supposed to be a clarification memo. I think it really just confused folks more, because I called EPA, I said, what do you really mean by this? Can they use these amounts that you've estimated for residue? They said residue only you could measure. And I know San Diego County is trying to get a hold of them and try to get that clarified, because the states would like to back away from that, because it isn't really an environmental hazard to have a wrapper, go into the trash. It's strictly the P-listed triple rinsing issue that we have to deal with. So that's still happening. Okay, so here is our first opportunity. Let's see if I can get this right. Which of the following regulatory bodies impact pharmaceutical waste management? In this case, when we start the music or start the clicking here, it'll show you in a minute, you click each one that applies, or whichever answer you think is best, and then you press send. And you'll have like 30 seconds. Is everybody ready? Okay, let's see if we can make this work. Oh, that didn't work. Okay, let's back up. I should have brought my mouse. Let's see. Let me try it this way. There. Woo, thank you. Oh, no. Okay, so this one? Yeah. Okay. I got so much technology here. We got 11 seconds left. Responses are piling up. Here we go. Are you ready? All right. All of the above. Congratulations. Congratulations. That is the right answer. So good for you. Now I've got to use this to advance my slides. If I get one more piece of technology, I'm going home. Back to Wisconsin, where we, don't do things like this. Okay. RCRA, you know more about RCRA than I do, that's for sure. And just wanted to emphasize what we tell the hospitals is to let them know that there is a law like this, that they are liable as a business to follow it, that there are significant concerns, and only 5% of the drugs become RCRA federally but that they can be fined at least federally $37.5 per violation per day. That usually gets enough attention to get people moving. Now, one of the difficulties with the Medical Waste Management Act, the Department of Public Health, which was DHS back then, did go out and talk a lot about collecting the non-RCRA hazardous, but at that time, there wasn't a lot of information coming from DTSC about the RCRA part. So what you may be seeing, or have seen, is a lot of the white containers for the non-haz, or CalHaz drugs as we call them, and not so many black containers for the RCRA drugs. So that's one of the things that folks are working on. In terms of a continuum of enforcement, I thought it might be interesting to just kind of take a moment and look at this, because this differs by state. You're always, of course, going to find your pharmacies regulated, your acute care, your long-term care. What may not be regulated as businesses are assisted living and independent living. It really depends in terms of whether they're considered a, quote, business establishment. If it's a home in a neighborhood, it may not be regulated. And then, of course, never regulated by under RCRA would be the consumer as an individual. So just something to think about there. We do help folks understand that they have a liability up through the food chain, so to speak, all the way up to the CEO of the hospital. And that is helpful in terms of getting funding, because there's obviously a lot of competition for funding these days at hospitals. You know, they're strapped also, so they're going to spend money where they have to. But typically, pharmacy, nursing, environmental services, facilities, those groups are all kind of on the hook. And then I mentioned the Joint Commission. Yeah, I'd kind of like to wait till the end, if we could, for questions.
I just don't understand that chart.
Oh, that was a, dare I go back? Do I use the red one to go back? Is that okay? Yeah. Okay. This is an org chart of a hospital. So down at the bottom, you've got all your basic department directors, and it's in your handout if you can't read it all. Normally, the understanding is anyone who is responsible for determining how drugs will be discarded, which would be the heads of pharmacy, environmental services, facilities, sometimes nursing, and usually nursing gets caught as being above pharmacy in the org structure. So it's really those people who are involved in making the critical decisions and enforcing it throughout the organization. A staff nurse would not be liable. A staff pharmacist would not be liable, but certainly the manager of each of those departments would be in the liability chain. Is that helpful? Okay. Okay, I mentioned Joint Commission. If you wanted to quote, or cite something to folks to help them understand that, one of the good ones is what we call the standard of care under the what's called EC, Environment of Care 0.02, 0.02, 0.01. They've got very specific SOPs that they follow, that they have to manage their hazardous materials and waste appropriately, and that would be more of your EVS, environmental services and facilities folks. When you get to pharmacy, it's under the medication management standard 11.03, that they have a process for managing high alert and hazardous medication. So that's just a way that you can maybe relate to that a little bit more for them. One of the things that I want you to be aware of, where your hospitals and other healthcare facilities are going to be really confused, is that the word hazardous is used in so many different ways in our culture. So they're used to biohazardous, okay? They're used to what we call OSHA hazardous. So in other words, if I'm in the pharmacy preparing chemotherapy, or I'm a nurse administering chemotherapy, I should be wearing a gown, I should be gloved, I should follow what we call universal precautions in terms of not exposing myself to the chemotherapy. That's an OSHA hazardous drug. So I'm very careful when I talk to hospitals to talk about the waste as hazardous waste, not hazardous drugs. If you say hazardous drugs to a pharmacist, they're going to think you're talking about chemotherapy and prepping it, and delivering it. So just verbiage is really important. And then, of course, the California is now non-RCRA hazardous. I used to say California hazardous, but I got beaten about the head so much that I now say non-RCRA hazardous. And then, of course, DOT has a whole other set of rules around hazardous once it goes out the door. So you can see for the folks that have to manage this, it is confusing. This is a chart to just give you some actual drugs. You'll be able to read it better in your handout. We have in pharmacy a whole set of definitions for the OSHA hazardous, which are very different from your definitions for RCRA. And the slice in the middle is actually very thin. So we have a lot of drugs that are rough chemotherapy drugs, very toxic, that are not caught by RCRA at all. And I'm actually hopeful that, before I die, I see those added to the RCRA list because they are bad. What happened was they came out after 1976, and it never got updated. So you catch them under your non-RCRA hazardous, but we actually take a step further and say we believe they should go into the hazardous waste. They're that toxic. So hopefully that'll be helpful to you when you're discussing this with folks in healthcare, so that you understand what some of the differences are. And then I thought it might be helpful just to give you the quick flow of drugs. They're obviously coming into primarily the pharmacy from the drug distributor. There are a few departments like radiology who might be ordering their own drugs separately. That happens. They're then going to go up to the nursing units, and in the nursing units is where most of the drug waste occurs, because that's where you have IVs that have to be discontinued, partial vials, partial syringes, partial ointments, inhalers, things that were given and then DC'd or whatever might have happened. So you're going to see most of the waste up in the nursing units themselves. And then, of course, both of those departments have to be working with environmental services to pull the containers, get them to the storage areas, and then get them out to the right vendor. These are some of the ways that drugs can become a waste. I won't read through the whole list, but there's more ways than you can imagine. And it's interesting, when I first got into this business on the pharmacology side, I would talk to my directors of pharmacy and say, what kind of pharmaceutical waste are you generating? And they said, we don't generate it. We send it all to reverse distribution. I said, okay, there's two things wrong with that sentence. First of all, they weren't thinking about the waste they generated in their compounding areas when they make IVs. They weren't thinking about the waste coming off of the floor. They were only thinking about the outdated drugs that go back through reverse distribution. And what we've tried to also emphasize is that you only send back outdated drugs that are eligible for credit, not waste, because it's really not a waste management system. It never was intended to be. That leads us right into this. This goes all the way back to 1981 to some guidance letters that came out from EPA about, 1991. No, the one was 1981. That was the early one. So we help them understand that if they've repacked drugs themselves at the pharmacy, which a lot of them do, those are not eligible for credit. They shouldn't be sending them back. If they bought flu vaccine on a non-refundable basis, they should not be sending it back. So those are some of the items that we mentioned. So we've tried to give them some examples. The drugs on the left are still in the manufacturer's packaging. They're outdated. They're eligible for return. They might be credited. That's what the reverse distributor does. They manage all the policies. And then the drugs on the right had already been sent up to the unit. They're patient labeled. These will not be credited. They are waste, and they need to be managed as waste. So that's one area where you can help the folks that you work with understand they should not be shipping waste to reverse distributor at this point. There's always things up in the air about maybe allowing that, so we'll see what happens down the road. It might have happened under universal waste. I don't know what will happen going forward. Okay, now we're going to kind of dig in, because I love talking to a RCRA group because I can go fast and your eyes don't glaze over as quickly. When I do this with pharmacy, they go, So P-listed chemicals, acutely hazardous, what we tell them, and part of what I'm doing this for is to let you know what we've been informing folks about. If it's a sole active ingredient, if it's unused, and also the empty container at this point, it's P-listed. Dilution just gives you more of it. There's no way out. When you get to U-listed, same thing except for the definition of empty, which is no longer triple rinsing. But the sole active ingredient unused, you've got a hazardous waste. We actually can manage those pretty well in pharmacy once people know what the drugs are, because the list is so static at this point. Where it gets tough is the toxicity characteristic and primarily ignitability. We do see corrosivity. We've only got a couple drug forms. What we call them are finished dosage forms, where we've, the manufacturer has taken the compound, put it into a way it can be used in the human body. Most of those will never hit corrosivity. There's like 3 of them on the whole market. And reactivity came out with nitroglycerin. We'll talk about that in a minute. But the big ones are ignitability and toxicity under RCRA. Those are tough. Those are very tough for folks to identify. So let's start at the P list, because this is kind of the bad boy list, if you will, in terms of containers. Arsenic trioxide is a chemotherapy drug. You'll typically find it only at really high-level tertiary care cancer centers or big hospitals. It's not usually used routinely at every cancer center. In this situation, the ampulate came in, stays hazardous, but you do have an exclusion for the syringe. When they pulled that drug up with a needle and syringe and put it into an IV, we have that EPA exclusion that came out some time ago that excluded used syringes that held P and U listed as long as they weren't characteristic, and California accepted that. So they can put that used syringe in what we're calling trace chemotherapy, which is a yellow container, but if they have drug left or the ampule, it goes into the black container, because now it's still RCRA hazardous. These are some of the things that we try to impress them on. Epinephrine base, I'm so glad this happened. Colorado stimulated this a couple years ago, and as you're probably aware now, EPA kind of reversed a 30-year assumption about epinephrine HCl or other salts of epinephrine, and determined that only the base is P-listed. All of the drug we use are the hydrochloride, the bitartrate, or the borate, because the base is too insoluble for drug use. So none of the epinephrine you see in the hospital is P-listed or any other healthcare facility. That was huge. That was really huge for healthcare because they're very heavy. They occur all over, IVs and so forth. Nicotine, of course, is still regulated. What we tell our clients is that when you put the patch on, when you take the patch off, it's no longer regulated under RCRA, but we recommend that you dispose of it as a RCRA hazardous waste because it's got most of the drug left. If you're not going to do that, you need to put it into the non-RCRA has for California. So that would go into the white container, in some cases white or blue, depending on the company. So it gets a little bit tricky when you start going between those two. It's simpler to just train nurses that anything nicotine related goes in the black. And certainly the envelope still has to go in the black, and that's what's causing so much consternation because you're not going to triple rinse a little packet. Nitroglycerin came out a number of years ago under the hazardous waste identification rule because it was listed only for reactivity, and if it didn't exhibit that, it didn't have to be managed as P-listed, so that's good news because that was heavy also, a lot of IVs. Phentermine just changed. A competitor, I had asked a couple years ago, never got an answer. One of our competitors asked again, and Lisa Lauer at EPA did send an email, and they're trying to get a memo out now that they're going to consider that the same way they considered the epi salts. So if it's phentermine HCl, hydrochloride, which is what all the phentermine is in a drug form, it will not be P-listed. That's the diet drug from fen-phen. You don't see it that much anymore, actually more of a retail item. And then physostigmine and the salicylate is used in the OR and in surgery centers. Very small amounts, usually comes in ampules, but that's something to watch for because, again, the ampule would remain a hazardous waste. And then warfarin over 0.3%. All the tablets that we've looked at in terms of toxicity characteristic are over 0.3%, so they're all P-listed. So, and then, of course, the residue is in the packaging at this point. That's what's still up in the air. But right now, those still have to manage as hazardous waste. So right now, you're still, pardon?
I was going to ask you, on the nicotine, isn't the inclusion of nicotine on the P-listed waste, the nicotine gum, for example, or even the patch, they're basing it on the sole listed, or the sole active ingredient.
There's been folks saying we don't think it's the sole active ingredient, but so far EPA has really not wavered on that. They also tried the medical.
Organistic hominin between pharmaceutical sole active ingredient and chemical sole active ingredient definition?
Well, I don't want to spend, maybe we can talk later because we got a lot to go through. The other one was at one point the RCRA hotline said it was a medical device or a manufactured device and it fell out of regulation. EPA reversed that decision. So right now we're telling folks anything to do with with nicotine, consider it P-listed because there's a little too much ambiguity around that. Maybe that'll change. This is just a partial list of the U-listed chemicals. There's about 25 of them. Some of them are really old drugs. Chloral hydrate, you'll still see. It's used in pediatrics as a sedative. It is U-listed. It's also a controlled substance. That C4, if you see that on a package, that means it's regulated by the Drug Enforcement Administration. So that makes it even more challenging because now you've got, two high-level concerns, both RCRA hazardous and a controlled substance. What we tell folks is if you have time in pharmacy, make up individual oral syringes, like you give your kids where you can pull the drug up and squirt it in their mouth. That way you're not wasting part of a cup every time, 5 cc's or whatever. So that's one way to minimize waste because we really want to minimize if at all possible. So that works. The drugs in red are all chemotherapy. They're the only other chemotherapy drugs that are listed under RCRA, except for the arsenic trioxide is P-listed. We've got over 100, I'll show you in a minute, that should be regulated and aren't under RCRA. So just to give you an idea of kind of where we stand, these were the ones in use in 1976. Lindane you don't have to worry about here, and then of course selenium sulfide occurs in your shampoos, and it's for the heavy metal selenium. Okay, this is just an example of what these drugs look like when they come into pharmacy. There is absolutely nothing on them, on the packaging, in the insert, in any of the literature that tells pharmacists whether it is PU or characteristic waste. So you can see the challenge they face when they stock between 2,000 to 5,000 different products in their pharmacy. It's really a unique environment from a regulatory perspective. Okay, let's see if I can do this a little easier this time. Which of the following statements about P-listed drugs is false? And I'm not going to read them to you, and we're going to start right in here. Oh, you only got 15 seconds. It's just one, and you don't even have to hit send. Just hit the one that you think is correct. Don't you love the music? Okay, let's see how you did. Excellent. Well, pretty good. Over half of you said that having the characteristic of corrosivity is what P-listed doesn't have, and that's actually the correct answer. The packaging is disposed of hazardous because it hasn't been triple rinsed. They are acutely hazardous for humans. They are disposed of in black containers. Kind of an unfair question because I haven't really talked about that too much, and they are regulated by EPA. So there we go. Let's keep moving here. Ignitability, as I mentioned, this is one of the tougher characteristics for pharmacy for these products because this information you really have to dig for. You have to go into the MSDS, you have to go into some of our references to find out. And what we've told folks is that if it's an aqueous solution containing 24% alcohol or more by volume and a flash point of less than 140 degrees Fahrenheit, it's going to meet the characteristic of ignitability. You can't find flash point data for these drugs. So basically the 24% alcohol, call it a hazardous waste. We had a company challenge us, and they said that if the flash point was below 140 and it was less than 24, that it would still be hazardous. Went to EPA, got a reading from them. They said, no, this is the exclusion. It was negotiated by the beer and wine industry, and anything, it doesn't matter if it flashes or not, as long as it's below 24%, and it's aqueous, which is 50% or more water. So those are your criteria around that particular definition. We do have a few non-aqueous preparations like flexible collodion, which you use in wart remover. It evaporates so quickly because it's acetone and ether, or just plain acetone, or of course alcohol, 99% or 91%, whatever, that will definitely hit this. And we have a few, the main oxidizer we've got is the silver nitrate stick. And that's about this long. It's got a little bud on the end of silver nitrate. It's used to cauterize the skin. What we've learned is that if they've used it by putting water on it, which is activating it, and then cauterizing, you're using up the oxidizing potential. That's gone, and enough of the silver stays on the skin if it doesn't hit for silver. So if it's used, it's really a solid waste. If for some reason they're throwing it out unused, which doesn't make a lot of sense, then it would fall under, definitely under oxidizer, D001, and probably for silver. I don't actually have data for silver because we just worried about the oxidizer. But you're not going to see a lot of that. Flammable aerosols you will see. Some of the inhalers for asthma and so forth still have a flammable propellant. What we've been telling folks is collect those separately under aerosols as an aerosol, and then we've actually asked them to put any pressurized drug aerosol in that container because a lot of the incinerators don't want the aerosols coming without announcement, so to speak. So we're kind of going above and beyond there, but that kind of gives you a bit of a view of that. We have some interesting items like paclitaxel, which is a chemo drug. When it comes into pharmacy, that vial there, it's 50% alcohol practically. When you dilute it into an IV, it falls out of regulation for ignitability. We'd like to see them dispose of it as a hazardous waste because it's still got a chemo drug in it, but it's no longer ignitable under the rules. We don't see a lot of corrosivity either. If you think about it, you're not going to be putting corrosives on or in your skin, your body, but they could have it in the, certainly the laboratories, which we don't deal with particularly. There's a few compounding chemicals left in pharmacy like glacial acetic acid, sodium hydroxide, so it's worth just asking about compounding chemicals. A lot of them have cleaned house now. Back in the old days, people saved everything and it really got ugly. Picric acid. How many of you here have done the picric acid bomb squad routine? I figured there'd be a few. You won't find that in pharmacy, thank goodness. But obviously you know the definition of the low pH and the high pH. So, toxicity. This is the one that gives us the most heartburn because it's so subtle, and of course every one of the 40 chemicals that are listed under toxicity has their very own milligrams per liter in terms of passing or failing the toxicity characteristic leaching procedure. So we don't really have the drugs in our hands, so what we did as pharmacology is we went through and did a paper T-clip. So we gave the worst case. If everything went through the column and it all ended up in the leachate, would it pass or fail? If it failed, we've told our clients, you've either got to run a T-clip, get a T-clip from the manufacturer, or manage it as hazardous, because you got to demonstrate that it passed. You know, it's not a assume it passed type thing. The items that we find in drugs, arsenic, of course, we've already caught that under the P list. Barium sulfate in the barium enemas and barium drinks. The good news is it took years, but we finally got the only manufacturer to come up to run T-clips, and I think all of them except 2 now have gone through and passed. So we've been able to kind of take barium pretty much off the list of items, and they can demonstrate it now. We've actually got it on our website, so they can look up those drugs and demonstrate that for you. Cadmium, chromium, and selenium occur in your multi-mineral preparations. Centrum silver is a hazardous waste when you discard it. Yes, I know. That's exactly how some of our clients feel. But it fails. I believe it was for selenium. It was and chromium, both of them? Okay, thank you. I just talked to Pfizer recently. They've changed their MSDSs now, and they're going to that follow all local and federal, rules. That doesn't help anybody, because you guys are relying on them to know what's in their product. So it's getting harder instead of easier. So we covered those. One of the things I want to mention is what we call total parenteral nutrition, where you're feeding someone, through the vein. And when that comes in as chromium or selenium to pharmacy, it's going to be concentrated, and that's most likely going to fail. When it gets diluted again into an IV, it'll fall out of regulation. So there is definitely, and they're not doing it to, treat it, because I had pharmacists on ignitability in the beginning say, can't I just dilute my, alcoholic preparations? And I said, well, that's called treatment, and you don't have a treatment permit, so probably not a good idea. Here they're actually diluting it for the purpose of use, which is a whole different ballgame. So just to make you aware, that can happen. Let's see, M-cresol. That is the preservative in human insulin, which you'll see all day long. If it's a multi-dose vial of any kind, or even the insulin pen, that's going to have M-cresol most likely. It'll say it right on there, and that'll fail the T-clip. Likewise, if you see a mercury preservative in any of the vaccines, eye preps, ear preps, that's going to cause failure of the T-clip, because it's, 0.9 milligrams per liter, something like that. It's so small that it's very difficult not to have that fail. And then selenium, we talked about selenium. Silver, we have a lot of burn cream and that sort of thing. Now we're getting silver in more and more items because it's considered an anti-infective, even catheters and dressings. And I don't know that those manufacturers realize they really have a responsibility to run a T-clip on that. So that's going to be interesting to see how that plays out. I've talked about most of these already, so I think we can move on from that one. This is, again, just some pictures of what these look like. I don't know if I mentioned the multi-dose flu vax.